Hey, Composing Gloves here. I'm wearing a hat, and today we're going to be talking about dimension in a mix. Dimension in a mix simply means that your mix has a sense of space. You're able to say, oh, it sounds like it's here, or it sounds like it's in a big room. It sounds like it's in a small room. Like you have a sense of dimension, of depth, of width. There's a sense there. And this is very important for a mix, and changing dimension can make a mix very interesting, or it could be distracting, depending on the type of recording or song you are producing. And so let's really quick talk about this. Now in this video, we're going to be going over the different methods used, but we're not going to be going over like how the methods work or the application of them in depth. We're going to be approaching those in separate videos. So first, let's look at how we do this thing called sound localization. So it's the ability we have to say where a thing is in the room. And I must point to the critical listening series big time for a lot of these things, because we go over psychoacoustics, we go over the ear and how it works. We go over just a lot of really interesting things. Neurology is covered a little bit in there, so you go check that out. Now, I'm not an expert in like neurology, for example, but I know enough to be able to do some interesting things. So when you could go into a room, take me in the room, blindfold me, spin me around, and then go to different parts of this room and clap, and I would be able to point right at you, like just bang, you're over there, you're over there. How am I doing this thing called sound localization? Well, what happens is there are two big methods. There is interaural timing differences, and there are interaural intensity differences. The first one, interaural intensity differences, is panning. Is that sound reaches your ear, both your ears, because you need two, because you have to compare them in your brain. They reach your ear at the same time, your ears, and then you say, oh, it's louder on the left side, so the sound is that way. And that's pretty much what goes down. The other one that happens is there is a timing difference associated with this. And so if you were to clap and there would be some of the sound would hit my ear directly, that would happen first, right? So I'd be like, oh, it's that way. And then there'd be a series of reflections around the room that would all happen later. We call this reverb. And there's actually there's names for the different amount of times it has to hit walls before it comes back to your ear. But the big point is, the direct sound would hit one ear before it hits the other, because it has to go around your head and do all this stuff. And so I'd be able to say, oh, it hit my ear first, so you're that way. Oh, and usually these things happen as a combo. So I'm like, oh, it's louder and it hit my ear first. And I'm like really sure you're over there. And I can use these delays, these bouncing off the walls. And there's going to be, of course, there's acoustic properties that take place. Like some sound could be absorbed, has to diffract around things. There's just all these different things that go on. But we use this information to say, oh, the sound source is over there. So it makes sense that when we're creating dimension in a mix, we're going to use intensity differences and timing differences. And as you just saw, it can get quite complicated. And you've seen a very basic one, which is panning. Well, my voice cracked a little right there. Panning. Panning is just when, it's louder in one speaker than it is in the other. And we've already talked about that, and so we don't need to approach that one. But when we get into delays, we can get into some pretty weird scenarios. Another thing is that you can play tricks. Things can get quite confusing, and we can make it so that you consistently point to the wrong spot. If we were to do this test under a particular set of circumstances, when you trick yourself, because you got to remember, where things sound like where they are is going through your brain. So it's a brain thing going on here. So we call it psychoacoustics, and if you can play cool psychoacoustic tricks to make sound like it's behind you, do all these like interesting things. And so again, psychoacoustic type stuff is covered in the critical listening series. We're going to be looking now at the main methods. I have a mix here. The mix uses a variety of methods. One of them, the first one should be noted, is it is panned. There is panning going on. You can't see it right here because it's not super apparent, but I'm actually automating the panning. And that's something that I like to do. We talked about it in the dynamic panning video earlier in this series. And so that shouldn't be a surprise. But then we have things here like delay. This is just regular delay. So if I were to just play this one section. So you see there's actually, the piano's got a delay as well. Just checking to make sure my stuff's muted, the speakers. So you can actually hear that my voice goes house. And the piano's got a delay on it. It gives you a sense of space, because you're like, oh, this sounds like a really big space, because that's your experience. That's literally, you've just memorized where in your life you've heard similar sounds and you've associated that with large spaces. So that's pretty interesting. And so that's our first method is we have delays. And then of course, well, I guess it's our second method because we have panning, and I'm moving the panning around. And by moving it around, I am creating another sense of space. Again, we already looked at that. And then now we could there's a bunch of different types of delay. So that's like our regular delay, right? But then we have things like reverb, which you also perceived during that time. So if I were to play just this top part. So we have a delay there again. You see there's just delays everywhere. But if you heard that top line, let me go ahead and mute this guy. Okay, so you hear that it has got some reverb on it. It takes a long time to decay out, like a long time. And I'm pretty sure on the thing itself, because you can actually create what sounds like reverb just by creating long release times on your sound. But that's more of a sound design thing. And so you can see here we have some reverb. And so reverb is, it's just bouncing. We're simulating. There's a whole bunch of different kinds. There's algorithmic, there's plate, there's convolution, spring, and they all have like their own sort of sound because they use different methods to create a reverb. But at the end of the day, they're trying to replicate ordered reflections. And so if I were to say a sound in a room, there's going to be a series of reflections that comes back to me. And the speed and the amount of absorption that happens and the diffraction and all the stuff in the room will affect this sort of a sound. So if I'm like talking, the first sound that's going to come back and hit me is going to be the one on my screen, probably. This one actually could hit me pretty fast too. So I could have an interesting relationship with this going on. And so all these things need to be taken into account. A lot of people just consider their walls, and it's quite a bit more than just your walls, which is why acoustically treating a room can be so challenging sometimes, is you just have all this, it's just loads and loads and loads of things to think about. So we're not going to be talking about that. I'm just going to encourage you to reference your mix on several systems, because the chances of someone listening to your mix in the environment that you mixed it in is not very high. And also the chances of them listening to it in an environment that's like acoustically good, like as far as like taking all these things into account, if you want to call that good, is very low as well. They are not going to go to a studio to listen to your mix. So you just got to keep those things in mind. Now, if you have a specific scenario, then that's great. Anyways, I digress. Back to reverb. So reverb is we've got these delays, and they come off these various walls at various times, and they come back to us, and each one will give us some information, but each time it hits a particular surface that has an absorption coefficient, will actually absorb some of the sound. And so we're able to, by recreating this effect through the use of a delay, we can actually recreate reverb. And that's what these things are doing. So it's got a little algorithmic reverb in there. It's going through some sort of an equation and spitting it out. And you see on here, we've actually been given dry, wet, and we've also got size. And so we're able to affect some of the values in this algorithm to be able to create a desired effect. And they've labeled them for us. They haven't given us like the mathematical properties, because it's far easier for us to just say, oh, this is going to simulate a bigger room. Like we'll just increase the size, stuff like that. But you'll see on other plugins, they'll give you very different controls that maybe are a little more specific. So, okay, so we got reverb, and then there's one other really big one I want to share with you. So we have a regular delay, our panning, our reverb, and we also have multi-tap delays, which we did not talk about. But for example, if I were to open up a delay bank, this is a multi-tap delay because you can have multiple delays. You can filter each delay differently. You can pan them differently. You can make it what's called ping pong. So it'll bounce on one side, it will move over and bounce on the other side, and it will go back and forth. It's ping pong, and you have you could just do all sorts of things to take advantage of these, create level differences. You could also increase a feedback loop so that they actually get louder, which is counterintuitive. So it sounds like it's almost getting closer. You can do all sorts of interesting things. Now, the one I want to share, the last one, is we have this thing called a phase shift, or basically a Haas effect delay. And there's a couple plugs that do this, but you can do this with any delay that gives you really short values. So for example, if we open up the Fruity Delay 2 and turn the volume off, we have this here stereo. So this is the feedback. So we don't want the feedback, right? And we'll just get rid of the timing. Who cares right now? Right now we have this offset, and this offset is a delay between when the sound comes out the left and the right. But it's a super small delay, super tiny. So you'll actually create a stereo image using these fancy delay tricks, which is something I hinted to earlier in this series. We also have plugins like the Stereo Shaper and the Stereo Enhancer, which also will help us do. So you see phase offset versus just a straight delay, which you can see here we actually have a delay versus a phase. And we'll be talking about what this kind of stuff can mean later. But if we look at what I like to do is I'll create with a stereo shaper. I'll just grab an effect like a stereoized effect, and I'll be messing with that. And then I will automate the effect on and off. And that allows me to change the sense of space in the mix in a really interesting way. We go from like mono or whatever it was is already stereo to after this plugin. And so I change the sense of space as we go to usually to try and enhance moments. So, well, always to try and enhance moments. I don't want to do anything counterintuitive. I'm sure there's an example of this somewhere in here. It's a very common thing I like to do, but I can't find one. But anyways, this thing is very based on this. So I'm going to play for you this section, and I use these methods to make it sound like I change the space from far away to closer. I really mess with space in this mix. You'll hear lots of reverb and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and play this portion for you, and just pay attention to the delay effects, like this sense of space. So anyways, you get the idea. So that obviously there's a lot of automation going on here, and there are things going on internally inside plugs, and just there's a lot of stuff. So it's kind of silly how few notes there are about how much freaking automation is going on. This is insane. But you can see that we go from something that gets very, very large and big, and then it resolves, and all of a sudden it sounds like it almost like snaps forward, because a lot of these things just turn off suddenly, and that causes it to jump forward and sound a lot more clear and crystal, especially with the comparison of what we just had, how it became all like mushy and swelled out. And so it's kind of just an interesting deal. So that's an introduction to dimension in a mix. Those are the techniques used, and we're going to be looking at those more in the future videos. If you have any questions, let me know. Support me on Patreon, subscribe, and have a blessed day. Star.